Hey everybody, it's Stephen Feuerstein, and I'm back from my last Feuer tip of 2021. Thanks for joining me. I'm here all by myself. Michelle is taking a well-deserved end-of-year break. So I've got a great show lined up for you today. We're going to talk about a relatively little used feature of PL/SQL because on the last Feuer tip of the year, a few days before Christmas, I figure who's going to show up? Might as well talk about something obscure. But should be interesting. And then I'm going to, of course, present three different organizations. One of you will donate to help heal our planet. And I usually show you or offer one of my favorite cultural artifacts, but today I'm going to go into a favorite anti-cultural artifact rant and share some probably controversial ideas about that. Okay, so let's dive into the PL/SQL. We'll save all my non-PL/SQL stuff for the end. So let's talk about Authid and Invoker rights. Share my screen, please, Mark. Okay, so first of all, in fact, stop sharing my screen for a second. So first, let's talk about some general principles around PL/SQL and compiled code, and then we'll talk about how Invoker rights can change that, or the Authid clause. So in general, by default, when I create a procedure at the time of compilation, procedure or function or package, the compiler needs to check every single database object, like a table name and a view and an object type and so on, and make sure that my references to them are valid in my code. So if I have a select column name, that column name needs to be in the table for my code to compile. It also means that I have to have directly granted privileges on all the database objects that I am referencing. So at the time of compilation, I have to have directly granted, not role-based privileges to all the database objects I've got. That's why, for example, I might be able to write a select star from table in SQL Plus or SQL Developer, just run a native SQL statement. But if I put that same select statement inside a PL/SQL program unit, I get an error, 942, table overview does not exist, because I need directly granted privileges inside a proc to compile, whereas I can use role-based privileges when I'm just running a query or anonymous block. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Directly granted privileges you need at the time of compilation. Yeah, the compiler needs to know that I've got access to the things I'm referencing. And that also means that when I grant execute authority on my program unit to another schema, then when that person connected to that other schema calls my code, they're running as if they had my privileges. And that way, it's a great technique. I can control access to underlying database objects. I can create rules around those objects in my PL/SQL code and guarantee that since I only grant execute on the package and never on the underlying data structures like tables, the only way for you to get at those tables is through my code, and therefore I can provide very strong security, performance optimization, maintainability of all the code against those data structures. And in a way, that's the heart and soul of SmartDB, by the way, as well. Okay, so that's the whole idea, putting aside the question of Authid clause and Invoker rights. But as of, I don't remember, 9 or 10 or 11, it's been a while, Oracle added the Authid clause. And you have two choices. It can be Authid definer or Authid invoker. Authid definer is definer rights, which is what I just described, that when you run a program, you have all the privileges of the definer of that program. But Authid current user is what is called invoker rights. And what that essentially means is that when I run your code, the PL/SQL compiler kind of reflects back into my schema and my privileges and reevaluates all the references to database objects in that program unit according to my privileges, not the definer privileges, which can lead to some really interesting scenarios. So let's take a look at some code and we'll explore as we go. Please share my screen. Okay, so we're going to start off with something very simple and actually keep it pretty simple. So in my S. Feuerstein account, I've got two, S. Feuerstein, S. Feuerstein 2. Hopefully they're all recently reconnected. I create a table called my data in S. Feuerstein, and I put 10 rows in it. And I've got a little procedure, and here's my Authid clause. And notice it says current user. This is an invoker rights program. And in this program, I'm going to select the number of rows from my data and display it. Can't get much simpler than that. And that's why if inside my S. Feuerstein schema, I say show data, I should have reconnected just before I started, but now it's going to do the reconnection, and then it's going to show me my data, et cetera, et cetera. While this is going on, in fact, let's talk about what is really probably the biggest question people have about Invoker rights, which is, when should I use it? Like, why would I ever need this? And I actually, it's very hard to find online use cases for Invoker rights. That's probably why you've almost never used it. But here's what you'll see in the documentation for Invoker rights. So Oracle recommends two different scenarios where Invoker rights procedures, Authid current user, should be used. And they're kind of interesting. One is when creating a PL SQL procedure in a highly privileged schema. So let's say I've got a DBA schema and I've created programs in there that I want others to be able to use. I can grant execute on packages in my powerful DBA schema. Well, what I might not really want is, while people are running that code, to be able to access all of my high privileges data structures. So if I create it as an Authid current user program, even though it's in a high privilege schema, when somebody else calls that program, they only have their privileges to work with. There are other ways to get around this issue of accessing high privileged schemas, or at least the privileges in those schemas. And it's probably most critical when you've got dynamic SQL or PL SQL. But that's one scenario. The other scenario, which I'd never thought about and I just read about literally this morning, is when the procedure contains no SQL and is available to other users. So I've got a procedure like a utility procedure. It has no SQL in it, no references to database objects, and yet I let everybody use it. So in this case, because it has no SQL, there's nothing to resolve at runtime. So with Authid current user Invoker rights, at runtime, references to database objects like SQL-based objects, tables and views and so on, those are analyzed, but not code references. So what they're saying is that because they don't have to do any of that runtime checking of privileges, Authid current user can actually be more efficient to use than Authid definer. Never really thought about that before, something to keep in mind. Really, I have not checked to see what kind of differences in performance you see, but there they are. Before I go back here, just other use cases for Invoker rights generally. If I'm writing a utility that is going to be working with different data structures and different schemas, in other words, like a testing utility that everybody's going to be calling from their environment, it makes a lot of sense to define those Authid current user so they reflect back in and work with the data structures in those schemas. And the other use case I can think of, though it probably is rare, is I might have multiple schemas with the same table structures. Let's give you what is probably not a great example. I want to support a multilingual environment. So each schema has a different language. So George speaks German, Sally speaks French. And then we have a table with all the German versus French versus English text in them. Same table structures, different contents. Now, when I compile a program with definer rights, it's hooked at compile time to the data structures. It can't change at runtime. So at runtime, when you run a definer rights program, it's going to use that table referenced at compile time. But if I change it to Authid current user, then when Sally runs my code, it looks back into her tables and shows French. When George calls my program in my shared schema, they see German. So I can have one body of code supporting multiple schemas that have different data. Hopefully that was interesting. Okay, so I now reconnected, and I ran show my data, and it shows 10 rows. Cool. Now let's go back over here. Now what I'm going to do is go to S. 2, and I'm going to create a my data table there as well with just one row in it. And then I'm going to call S. from that schema. And notice I did a grant execute, so I can call it from the schema. This will probably also need to be reset. Let's see what happens. But you can already see on the screen, so you're going to see it again in a moment. It'll say count of my data equals 1. So literally I'm running the same code, and it's giving me different answers. How interesting is that? So that's the core idea. If I define it to be Authid current user, at the time of compilation, the compiler still needs to find an object either locally or via a synonym that can resolve the reference. So now let's go back to the code. So if I define it as Authid current user or definer, at the time of compilation, the compiler has to find a my data in this schema or a synonym to it to be able to compile properly. But at runtime, it doesn't matter what the reference was at definer time, at compile time. At runtime, the compiler wakes up and says, wait a minute, what is my data for this schema? and then it finds it, and then it works with that table. That's why, interestingly, you can end up with a table of view does not exist at runtime, even with static SQL, if you're using Authid current user. At compile time, you might have had a my data table, but when I try to run it from here, if there's no table there, let's try that. Go back here and let's drop table my data. Now let's try this again. Now, so here you go, 942 table of view does not exist. You can obviously run into that at runtime with PL SQL code, but it's going to be usually from a dynamic SQL execution because you didn't have the table name at the time of compilation to check. But this will even happen with static SQL when it's a current user. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Now let's take a look at one other interesting aspect. There are many interesting aspects to Invoker rights, but I think this one is something that's really important to get your head around. So what I'm going to do is work with the employees table now, and in S. main, you might be able to guess it. You should be able to guess it. Come on, you don't have to recreate and reconnect again, do you? Ugh, seriously? Fine, reconnect. So as you're about to see, you'll see the typical 107 rows in here eventually if it connects. Wow, what is going on here? There we go, thank you. 107 rows. If I run the same query from S4 0 rows. Okay, so 0 versus 107. Keep that in mind. Now, I'm going to create a number of programs in my number 2 account. One program shows the execution call stack, format call stack. So how did I get here? Then I've got a cool little program created by Solomon Jakobson, who's been around Oracle world forever. I think he's still active, mostly in the community forums, the OTN community forums. Really amazing SQL database person. And he came up with this mechanism for asking, are we currently running Invoker's mode? So if session user equals current user, then we've got Invoker rights mode. Otherwise, they might be different. So that's going to tell me whether or not I'm running an Invoker rights mode. I've got proc1. Proc1 says, how many rows do I have in the employees table? Show the execution call stack, and then display the number and display whether or not I'm an Invoker rights. If you're wondering what P.L is, if you've been around my world for, let's say, any time in the last 30 years, you might know that P.L is my replacement for dbms output.putline. You can find it on Live SQL if you want to download your own version. But instead of having to do things like this, I can just say, pass a string and a number, and it knows what to do. Pass a string and a Boolean, and it knows what to do. Okay, so show me how many rows I've got. In fact, so that's proc1. And proc2 does the same thing. How many rows are in employees? Show the call stack, all that other stuff, and then call proc1. Proc3 does all the same stuff, calls proc1, calls proc2, which calls proc1. Wow, that's probably kind of confusing, but it's the same basic pattern throughout. And also notice that proc1 is Invoker rights, proc2 is definer rights, and proc3 Invoker rights. So I have a mix of Invoker and definer. Okay, so let's go over to S. Feuerstein. What I want to do is we'll call proc1 for starters. Call proc1. Let's call number 2. Okay, here's the call stack. I called proc1. It called show execution call stack. It showed me the call stack. How many rows? I've got an Invoker rights program. So S. Feuerstein 2 is being called from S. Feuerstein 1. And it's an Invoker rights. So it looks at 107, which is in this schema. S. Feuerstein has 107 rows. Is it running in Invoker rights? Yes, it is. Now let's use 2. Run it again. Aha. Sorry. Got to go back here and change something, and then we'll run that again. Don't freeze up. Whoops. Here we go. I need a different proc1. That's for later. That's the final demonstration. Recreate proc1. Let's run this again. Go away. Run this. Okay, now proc2 calls proc1, does the count, and notice Invoker, and it says 0. Invoker writes false. So what's going on here? Remember when I called proc1 before, it said Invoker writes mcount 107. Let's pull that right back up, in fact. Right, so Invoker 107, and yet here's the same code being run, different result. And the difference is that I'm now calling a definer program, which calls an invoker program. And now I'll just finish the last part, and then we'll go back and take a look at what's going on. I'll actually call proc3. So proc3. No, that's not it. There, that might work. Okay, proc3 calls proc2, calls proc1. Proc1 invoker writes 0 rows, invoker writes false. Well, it is running under invoker writes. That's not quite the right phrasing. So what's going on here? Very simply, the thing to realize is that if any way along my stack, let's go back here for a second. This is invoker writes. This is definer writes. This is invoker writes. If any way along the call stack, in fact, could you stop sharing my screen for just a sec? So the point is that if you have an execution call stack with multiple programs in it, which you very likely will, and you start off with invoker writes, or at any point you go into invoker writes, and then you hit a definer writes program after you started invoker writes execution, from that point on down the stack, invoker writes is ignored, and it's all definer writes. And it kind of makes sense, right? You've broken the connection when you've entered the definer writes step. And from that point on, there's really no way to kind of get back to invoker writes. So invoker writes is really powerful. It'll allow you to reflect back into your schema, look at your table data structures, not the data structures at the compile time of some remotely compiled code, remote in terms of not your current schema. But you have to be very careful about making sure that everything along the call stack is invoker writes, or at least when you get to definer writes, it's all definer writes programs after that. Otherwise, you can end up with some pretty confusing stuff. Now, if you could share my screen again. So what do you do about that? So again, chances are if you're doing an invoker writes, pretty much all your packages will be invoker writes. But what you can do is use this little technique we've got here of checking session user and current user. What I'm going to do now is recompile proc1. And in proc1, I'm going to use my assertion package to assert that the following is true, that we're running in invoker writes mode. By the way, you can also download my assertion package from LiveSQL. Let's compile this. And that's first 2. And now, if I try to run proc3 again, watch what happens. Okay, so now instead of getting this result, seeing this and all of this, it says, no, 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 we got a problem. So we've actually, in the assertion package, we violated the assertion. Proc1 is not running in invoker writes mode. So we have a violation of the principle. We have invoker, definer, invoker. And by putting this code inside my invoker writes program, I'm making sure that if somebody along the way changed the execution path, will be notified of this problem. And you can see why this would be important to have. I might write the code initially, A equals B equals C equals D. It's all invoker writes. It's all beautiful. But somebody else comes along and creates program D under definer writes, and then calls one of my invoker writes programs after that. We've got a problem. So you might consider putting this kind of protection inside your invoker writes program. Whew. Okay, another thing, and then we'll see if we got, how are we doing on questions? It's pretty quiet. Oh, it's very quiet. Yep. Authid will usually do that to people. Quiet them right down. Prior to 12c, there was a funny situation where if you had a view and the view called a function, which was an invoker writes function, the invoker writes would be ignored. Now in 12c, you don't have authid current user. I don't know why not. you have bequeath current user. And if you add bequeath current user to your view definition, then it will recognize the invoker rights of any functions called in it and apply the rules properly. So if you have been using invoker rights, let's say you started in 10 or 11, and you were running into problems with the views and maybe avoided using views because of this problem, as of 12C, you can go ahead and change the view to bequeath current user, and then you should be okay. You'll get internal consistency between your program units and your views. Can you share my screen or stop sharing my screen, please? Okay, so that's the basics around invoker rights, Authid current user. One question I've got for all of you is, has anybody here used invoker rights and any use cases you'd like to share about why and how you use them? It's pretty rare, but it does come up, and I thought I'd see if anybody out there has been using it. So I'll give you a chance to think about that. How do I pick a person to pick an organization today if nobody's asked a single question? Well, Francisco put something, but k.l, I'm not sure what that is, Francisco. So I might just pick an organization. Let's wait a moment or two more to see if anybody has any use case thoughts for Authid, invoker rights. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to present to you a few different organizations, and I'll pick at the end in case nobody else comes up with comments. So if you could share my screen again. So the three organizations today: save some whales, save some giraffes, save some humans. The Trust for Public Land. So building public space and how people work within them, saving whales, and giraffe conservation. All good stuff. And boy, do we need a lot of help in our planet. So those are the three organizations. And if you could stop sharing my, no, don't stop sharing my screen. So what I want to talk about now is cultural artifacts. So generally every week I offer one of my favorite cultural artifacts, like a book or a movie, or invite my guest speakers to present one of their own. Today I want to offer something else, which is boo, boo, boo to cultural artifacts. Forget about cultural artifacts, music, books, movies, bad stuff. Ha! Why would I say that? Well, I love music. I love reading books. I love watching movies and TV too, but I just refuse to do it because I feel it's so bad for me and for humans. But in general, so if you've been watching me on reading me on Twitter or watching me for a while now, you'll know that I'm really into spending time outdoors. And my recommendation today for you is put aside human cultural artifacts and be outside. If there was any pledge that you feel like you can make for 2022 that can have a big positive impact in your life and the future of our planet and the people around you, it would be spend less time with devices, spend less time indoors, go outside and be in your planet. I think that in many ways, the root cause of so much of the problems we're having today, and wow, are we having problems today in human societies, is all about how disconnected humans are from our planet. And it's just getting worse. The pandemic made it worse. Everybody's going online for teaching, for talking, for meeting others. And now we've got the metaverse. Oh, Mark Zuckerberg, don't you have enough money? Could you please just retire and go away and leave humans alone? Elon Musk, you too. So to me, that's entirely the wrong direction to be going. And we should be putting aside our devices, going outside and saving all we can. There's a great book called All We Can Save. And here's a picture that I think portrays it really nicely from my perspective. I spend a lot of time going outdoors and removing invasives to allow native species to thrive, survive, and make it into the 21st, 22nd century. I don't know. And what you see here is a hillside inside a quarry near where I live. And that's all that brown stuff is kudzu. Kudzu is now going brown for the season. It will come roaring back next year. And on this entire hillside, besides some pines at the top, there's one cedar tree that's alive. And the only reason it's alive is that I decided I'm not going to let the kudzu get everything on this hillside. So every year, multiple times during the growing season, I'll come out and clear the kudzu away. And it's probably already grown about a half foot in this last year or two. So I'm going to make sure that no matter what else happens on this hillside, this cedar will make it. And hopefully the pines across the top too. So my message to you, please stop sharing my screen. So my message to all of you is go outside, spend time outdoors, and take action to heal our planet. I cannot tell you how profoundly changed my life has been by the time I spend outdoors cutting back invasives, cutting down trees and vines so that natives can grow. And also not just the trees, but also the native other plants and animals and insects that depend on those trees and those native species. So I have just been so profoundly moved by all this work I do and all the life that I save. It also keeps me in great shape. I haven't been inside a gym in about 12 years. If you have any interest in doing anything like this, I will be happy to work with you and find opportunities in your area. Even if you're living inside a city, there will be ways that you can make things better for the planet and therefore for all of us. Oh, and so why would I say that art and music and so forth are bad? Because I think they distract us more and more from our world. In fact, I think that people need desperately to be entertained by music, by books, by movies, because we lack the entertainment, the positive feedback we would get if we spend time outside. Any single leaf, any single insect that you look at closely will be more amazing and beautiful than anything humans will ever create. Okay, that's probably enough of a rant for today. And I have some comments here. Okay, let's see. Okay, so we will upload, I'll publish a blog post by the end of this week. I haven't actually started it yet, with some reference to Authid and all the code and all of that. Amin Adadia is asking, should we make all programs one or the other? So that's a good question. I think the answer is that it's unlikely that you would ever have all of your program units be Authid current user, because sometimes you'll just have generic utility packages. For example, your error logging utility. You don't want that to be Authid current user. That would mean that everybody would have to have their own log error tables, or they'd have to have granted privileges to all the log error tables. So some things definitely make sense to be Authid definer rights. And I think that in general, Authid current user is going to be used rarely. Check the Oracle documentation for those use cases that were pretty interesting. In other words, one example was if you have a procedure that has no SQL references in it, it's just all code, PL SQL code, you might want to make that Authid current user and see some performance improvements. But I cannot vet the difference in performance, and I imagine it's really, really minuscule. So what I would do is don't worry so much. If you don't have an Authid clause on your programs at all, which is quite likely, it's an Authid definer program, and that's likely what you want, and just look to apply Authid current user if it looks like it fits some of the scenarios. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just declare that we will donate money to the Trust for Public Lands and give $25 to them, and we'll have to save the money for giraffes and whales into the next year. Thanks for joining me. I hope that you have healthy, happy, relaxing holidays. Please do not take unnecessary risks. It's clear that even when you're vaccinated, even when you're boosted, you can get reinfected with COVID, especially the Omicron variant. And it's so easy to get, and it can have a long-lasting impact on your life and the life of others around you. I read about COVID side effects and the long-haul effects of COVID. It's really scary. So don't go indoors without a mask unless you absolutely have to. And even then, just get out as soon as you can. So happy holidays to all of you. I hope your 2022 is way better than your 2021, even if 2021 was okay for you. And for most of us, not so okay. So let's make 2022 a lot better. Take care, everybody. See you next year.